going to try to do two things. I'm going to deal a little bit more with the hemispheric dimensions. What is Hugo Chavez about and why does it clash, let's say, with Washington's agenda? And I'll focus on two things. One is oil, and I hope to have some time left. I may skip over a few slides. So I can talk a little bit about hemispheric integration, the difference between the Bush administration, and really it's not just Bush, it was Clinton as well, and their views of economic integration in the hemisphere and how those of Hugo Chavez differ. So those are two things I want to try to get through. So I call this Venezuela's vision and the U.S. agenda for the Americas. So we'll start by talking a little bit about oil. And you know where Venezuela is, I think, but I thought I'd put the map up just in case you don't. Very regionally diverse country. You can see where Caracas, the capital, is, and then there are the mountains in the west. If you ever get a chance to visit it, it is just a spectacularly beautiful place with just incredible variation in terms of the countryside and the fauna and the flora. It's a beautiful place. Now, you can see, I can't really, let me see if I got an arrow here. Yeah, I do, so I can use this thing. Here's the Orinoco River, right? And here's Caracas, and these are the high Andes. And here's Lake Maracaibo. Here's where a lot of the oil is, and a lot of the oil is here. And I'll show you that in a moment on the map. You probably have read about the nationalizations, or I call it the renationalization rather than nationalizations, because Venezuela, under the government that Olivia described, had in 1976 completely nationalized oil and passed a law that said that oil as a basic industry and had to be 100% owned by the Venezuelan people. What happened afterwards was they kind of found loopholes in the law where through service contracts and partnership they could readmit private foreign capital. I don't think that was a bad idea, by the way, to readmit foreign capital. I'm not sort of like an ultra-nationalist about these things. The real problem, as I'll explain in a moment, were the terms in which the earlier government decided to readmit foreign capital into the country. And the Orinoco Belt is where you have a lot of heavy oil. Now, I'll show you a few statistics on how much oil Venezuela has. This is a couple years old, but it's not too far out of date. This gives you an idea that, as you can see, outside of the Middle East, Venezuela has the largest reserves of crude, and this is predominantly light crude in the world, right? Now, it pales, though, compared to Saudi Arabia. But, you know, this is obviously outside of the Middle East. This is a very, very important country in terms of oil reserves. That makes it geopolitically important to the United States. It gets even more interesting if you start looking at heavy oil. Heavy oil is very thick. It's like tar. You know, imagine you've seen tar in the street on a hot summer day and it bubbles. Imagine what you have to do to emulsify it and make it liquid so you can take it out of the ground. Essentially, that's what you've got to do. You can imagine how much harder it is to get that sort of stuff out of the ground. And that's what the Orinoco, they call it the Orinoco tar belt, in fact, for a long time. And there are tremendous reserves, but they're very hard and very expensive to get out of the ground. Some of you may have heard of this idea of peak oil, which is the idea that the most productive oil fields in the world have reached maturity and we're going to have declining yields, right? And if that's right, it means that we're going to have to go to more remote places and we're going to have to take oil like heavy oil that's harder to refine and use to substitute for the oil we now use. Unless, of course, we all finally understand what environmentalists have been telling us and both conserve and find smarter ways to make our economy work. Unfortunately, I don't think we're smart enough to do that, so we'll end up keep finding ways to get more hydrocarbons out of the ground. And if we have to do that, if you look at, there's the total reserves in the Middle East, right? If you take Venezuela's proven oil reserves at an 8% recovery factor, that's not a whole lot. There are 235 essentially billion gallons of oil, a million barrels of oil in the ground. And at an 8% recovery rate, look how Venezuela's reserves go up. Now, if we up the recovery rate to 30%, which is high, by the way. We don't have the technology to do that yet, but you know, science and economics can change those kinds of things. But if you just take a 30% recovery factor, now look at what Venezuela is compared to the Middle East. So if we're looking ahead, maybe 40, 50 years, if we keep consuming, it's something I'm not in favor of, but I mean, if we keep consuming oil, increasing the consumption of oil, this oil is going to become important. So the stakes here are pretty high, right? And this is something that's important to understand in terms of the news of the last couple of days, because the contracts that the Venezuelan government has renegotiated have been precisely for the extraction of heavy oil. Right? That's been the last holdout for the foreign companies from the contracts with very generous terms that they got in the 1990s from the old regime. The last holdout area was in the heavy oil sector. And so that's what's been renegotiated in the last couple of weeks. And so you can see the stakes are very high because the companies and the government are looking ahead. So when they sit down at the table and they talk to one another, the companies, you might expect the companies to say, hey, we got a contract. You guys got to respect the contract. You can't change it. You know, this is who's going to come and invest here if you don't respect the terms of the original contract? The Venezuelan government says, well, you know, you can go ahead and you can take us to court and you might win, but when you come later looking for this oil, all right, you know, you're not going to find the door open. So this was business, and both sides recognized that there was something to be gained from renegotiating the contracts and coming to a new arrangement. This data gives you some idea of the extent to which the United States depends on Venezuela, and you can see that Mexico and the Persian Gulf states, even Canada, that depends on a particular year, exceed Venezuela. I think I just read in the paper yesterday that based on last year's statistics, which have come out, it now looks as though Canada and Saudi Arabia individually export more to us than Venezuela. But Venezuela remains a very important supplier of oil. And remember, Venezuela has never, not under Hugo Chavez, not under any government, ever cut the United States off from oil. During the 70s, during the Soviet, they sometimes called the OPEC oil embargo. That's the wrong name. That's the wrong name for it. It was the Arab oil embargo. It was Aramco. Venezuela continued to produce and export oil to the United States. The only time in which oil supplies were threatened was in December 2002 for 3 months, when the opposition, which counts among its numbers the old executives who used to be in charge of the state company, cut off the oil. Okay? That's the only time. But the Chavez government has never done it, and the only time it's, I don't even know if I should use the word threatened, they've essentially said, yeah, if you invade us, if you do something really wild, try to assassinate Chavez, yeah, we're going to shut the oil off. But they have never threatened us in any respect. Now, one thing they have done is they've talked about diversifying their exports. They're exporting more to China. You know, I studied Latin American politics. We had this thing called dependency theory. And for years and years, just about everybody said it's very foolish for Latin American countries to put all their eggs in one basket. And that meant to export one commodity and export it to one market. If you were Venezuelan and most of your oil exports were going to the United States, wouldn't it make sense to you to say we should diversify our market? I mean, I don't think this is done as sort of a threat to the U.S. It's simply good business sense to diversify your market. And that's one of the things that's been going on. So I'm going to talk about for a little bit now what Venezuela went through in the 90s before Hugo Chavez came in. And I told you that they had, Venezuelans in 1976 had nationalized the entire oil industry. It was a negotiated nationalization. Oil companies were ready to get out. The OPEC countries were controlling supply and pricing. Oil companies would just soon have them take the blame for high oil prices as themselves. They still controlled marketing. They still controlled refining. So they sat down, they cut a deal, and essentially the basic crude oil industry was nationalized. And then they began to, for various reasons that I can get into if you have questions later, the government began to reopen up the foreign investment. And again, this is not something I think was a bad decision. I actually think it made sense to bring foreign capital back in the country. The question is on what terms. So this oil opening, first of all, when they decided on the terms, the Venezuelans actually went to the World Bank, which provided a model contract. And essentially, this contract was embraced by the people who were running the state company. The state company is called Petróleos de Venezuela. It's been a state company since 1976. Guess what? When they nationalized the state oil company, they left the same managers in charge. Shell, Standard, all the others, they've been employing Venezuelans to run their oil companies for 20 years already. They called the people who were running the state oil company in Venezuela in the 80s the generation of Shell, because they had all begun their careers as executives working for the Shell division in Venezuela. So these were the people running the state oil company, and they're oil men. They think like oil men. So they were all in favor, actually, of kind of reducing, wow, I'm out of time already, the state's influence over the oil sector, and they turned to the World Bank for a model. What does the World Bank want to do? The World Bank wants to basically say, You know, the World Bank's model is essentially saying that it's a mistake for countries to demand royalty and to limit the access of capital to natural resources. If you know anything about neoliberalism, or if you think about NAFTA, for example, what was it? It was a treaty that allows capital to flow more freely across state boundaries with fewer restrictions. Essentially, what this was saying is that here's this resource in the ground. It's worthless as long as it's in the ground. What Venezuela ought to do is open up its oil sector to investment on good terms. The foreign capitalists will come in. They'll produce more. Venezuela exports more. It's going to make more money. Well, the problem with that analysis is once Venezuela started exporting more, so did Saudi Arabia. So did Norway. So did just about everybody else that exports. And pretty soon, you had a glut of oil in the world market. The time Hugo Chavez came into power in 1998, it's hard to believe, in 1999, 3 months after Chavez came in, the price of oil was $6 a barrel. $6. The average cost of production of a barrel of oil in Venezuela today is $14. Now they can also, there's some fields that produce less than that, so that doesn't mean they were losing money necessarily. That gives you an idea what the circumstances were. In a sense, they also semi-privatized. What happened was the state company, not the ministry that ought to be negotiating these contracts, but these oil guys running the state company began to negotiate strategic agreements, service contracts, a whole series of things that essentially allow the companies to come in on very favorable fiscal terms. I'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, something called internationalization. Now, Venezuela is very proud of Citgo. A lot of you probably heard that today Citgo offers discounted oil to poor people to heat their homes, for example. But actually, it was a bad deal. Citgo had really poor refineries. What was going on here? Actually, what was going on was that the people who were running the state oil company in the 80s, this goes back to the 80s, realized that essentially the state was taking all their profits. So what they did essentially was buy Citgo and some other foreign assets so they could transfer their profits overseas. If you know anything about multinationals and transfer pricing. So essentially they would sell Citgo, Venezuelan crude oil at discounted prices. Citgo would make big profits, and then they would let us keep the profits in dollars outside the country. Okay? This is why Chavez was so opposed to internationalization. But by the time that Chavez took power, I mean, selling Citgo would have been even a worse deal because they had already capitalized it. It was not, they couldn't just sell it off again, is what it comes down to. So this was called internationalization. It was a way essentially to offload profits overseas. And then finally, the oil guys running the oil company wanted to get Venezuela out of OPEC. What's OPEC? OPEC is a cartel of countries that have oil, right? They don't necessarily have powerful oil industries. Some are good. Venezuela has a very capable oil industry. Saudi Arabia basically rents it out to foreigners to do. So there's real variations, but all of these countries have in common that they want to regulate the international supply of oil to maintain a floor price. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into this in too much detail, but here's a general chart. Look at how Venezuelan oil production rose between 1990 and 1998 when Hugo Chavez comes in. It went from 2 million barrels a day to 3.5 million barrels a day. You're putting all that extra oil on the global market, and you're breaking the discipline of OPEC, essentially. That's one reason why oil prices fell all the way down to $6. Chavez came in and begins, one of his first initiatives is to strengthen OPEC again. Okay? Now, you can see basically those dip sort of towards the end. That's the so-called oil strike, where the managers, in a last desperate effort to keep control of the state oil company, essentially shut it down for 3 months, which was disaster, economic disaster for the country. But you can see that there definitely is a slacking off from that peak period, but some of it has to do with Venezuela accepting once again the OPEC discipline, okay, and going back into OPEC. And we can talk about, is that good or bad for us? Maybe that's not so good for us and for our cars, but it certainly was good for Venezuela. I don't think oil is at $70 a barrel today simply because Hugo Chavez strengthened OPEC, right? There's a lot more to the story than that. But a lot of it has to do with demand in China, for example. But there's no doubt in my mind that Hugo Chavez was the leader, in a sense, of the OPEC nations, more important than Saudi Arabia. He couldn't have done it without Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's production is just so important. But it was Venezuela that took the lead to create OPEC in 1960. And people don't know that, but it was Venezuela that sent a delegation to the Middle East and said, we should cooperate. And that was the origins of OPEC, and it was Venezuela that took the initiative to get OPEC back on its feet again. Now, I think I should skip ahead because I've only about 5 minutes to talk a little bit about ALBA, and I'm going to skip a lot of slides that have to do with current oil policy, but the bottom line here with petropopulism, as I call it, is that it's the reassertion of national sovereignty over the oil in the ground. It's the reassertion of Venezuela's right to say, wait a minute, this is a natural resource, it's exhaustible. The companies are walking away with huge profits, and we're not getting a large enough share. So at these prices, there's enough money for everybody. Let me say one more thing before I leave the topic of oil. 2 years ago, Hugo Chavez publicly got up and said, I would like to negotiate an agreement with the United States to stabilize the price of a barrel of oil at $50 a barrel. Okay? Now, at that time, oil was down to, had been at 60, it come down to 45, it went up, and of course, nobody even took an interest in what he had to say at the State Department or the Department of Energy. That sounds like a pretty good deal today, doesn't it? Now, would he have kept the deal? I think he would have. That would have been a deal between two states rather than between a government and a private company. That's just one thing to ponder right there is missed opportunity. All right, I've got 5 minutes, so I'm really going to be bad about this and skip over a lot of stuff I had to say. Let me throw a few things here at the end and talk just very quickly about ALBA, the integration. Because I think this is fundamentally the problem. I think oil is not the prime issue between the United States and Venezuela. I think it's an important issue. I think the government would like to break OPEC and that Washington doesn't much like Chavez's oil policy. Oil companies, it's business. They know they can get along. So I don't think it's the fundamental issue. More serious is what Chavez is doing with the money and his alternative vision for how to use the money to create kind of a Latin America integrated economic system. This slide I include because you can see, this alludes to something Olivia touched on. Look at the face of Hugo Chavez. The two figures on the right were the last two presidents of the oil company before Hugo Chavez. Now I have to say, as a disclaimer, that the current president also is very criollo, very white-looking too. But it says something, that in a sense, you had these guys from the oil industry, they're globalized. Their way of life was like mine. I love being globalized. I oppose globalization, but I love being globalized. I get to fly to Rochester, eat at nice restaurants. I get the internet. I love being globalized. That's my world. That's these guys' world too. Most of the people in Venezuela don't live in that world, right? And so there's both a class and a kind of ethnic, racial factor at work here that reinforces the different points of view of different social classes in the country. This shows you a little bit more again of the kind of mix in Venezuela. This picture I've chosen. You can see the woman with the red is kind of more the mestiza type figure or a mixture of cafe au lait, but then you have a very strong presence of Afro-Venezuelans, of African descendants in Venezuela as well. And listen, this is a quote from one of the former oil company presidents. I think it says a lot, because I couldn't believe this when he said it. Our country was never a colony, not of Spain or of any other power. What did I learn in school about 300 years of the Spanish Empire in Latin America? Discovery or encounter pertain more to Venezuela. But for OPEC, we could have aspired, because of our origins, cultural roots, and territorial wealth, to convert ourselves quickly into full associates of the First World. That's what the oil company executives wanted. Is that the end of my talk right there? No? Okay. This is underlying the coup. Again, if you look at the man sitting in front of the military people at the microphone is Pedro Estanga. Pedro the Brief, they call him, Pedro el Breve, because he lasted 48 hours. But again, you look at the contrast in the faces, in the crowds, and it tells you something that's more than just social class and more than just politics that divide Venezuelans. This graph shows you the impact of the strike in Venezuela and total oil production. This was where the last-ditch effort on the part of the oil company executives to hold on control of the company. It's just terrible I'm going this fast, I know. I want to get way ahead here, and I'm just going to use this slide, and then I'm going to show you three images at the end. The next couple ones, I go through these one at a time, but I don't have time to do it. I think that there is a fundamental difference, and I think this is more profound than the oil issue, between the U.S. agenda for the Americas which basically I would summarize as NAFTA for everybody. Okay? It's basically a vision of integration that's based on a neoliberal model, and for those, I apologize to people saying, what does he mean by neoliberalism? And there's different levels, I'm sure, of knowledge in the audience, and we can talk about that, but essentially, if you know anything about NAFTA, the US aspires to create something called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA, which is based on the NAFTA model. On the other hand, Chavez has put forward something called ALBA, the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas. One big advance toward ALBA was made just this past week when Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and probably Nicaragua, and probably Argentina, are all going to join together and create something called the Bank of the South. All right? And they're holding this as an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. Now, I mean, that's a remarkable step forward. It's not an achievement. If you don't get Brazil, this isn't going to work in the end. They've got a long way to go to make this work, okay? But it's a concrete step forward. 2-3 years ago, people were saying, this guy Chavez, you saw my opening slide, he's tossing the money around, it's a pipe dream, it's populism. This is concrete progress. It may take another 20 years to get where they want to go. But they've now got an institution that provides an alternative, so the next time Argentina, or it could be Uruguay, or it could be Guatemala, it finds themselves in need of financing to help pay off the debt, to help build infrastructure, they've got an alternative place to go. And, you know, people say, well, my God, they've wasted all that oil money. Look what they did with it in the 70s. You know, this makes a lot of sense. Now, that's Hugo Chavez. I mean, why can this happen? Because Bolivia and Ecuador aren't big enough. They don't have the resources to get us started. Venezuela does, because oil's at $70 a barrel. Okay? But I think it's extremely significant that Chavez could very easily say, I'm keeping the money, I'm going to spend it all in Venezuela because I want to stay in office to 2050, so I'm going to spend all the money here. Right? I think it's very significant, and this is the thing, again, I think that it's a good example of what divides the U.S. agenda and the Venezuelan vision. Because if Venezuela or Argentina or Bolivia no longer have to go to the IMF or the World Bank, that's not just economics at work, that's political power in the hemisphere at work, right? So there you got a fundamental challenge. So on the U.S. agenda for the hemisphere, I'd say is NAFTA for everybody, the free trade FTAA. They keep social issues off the agenda, right? NAFTA you've got these side agreements that have no teeth for environment and such. The ALBA actually has a social charter to guarantee minimum kinds of rights. Also create something like they had in the EC, a common fund, so that you can try to even out poor areas would get extra investment to try to even out the playing field. Pluralist democracy, promoted by the National Endowment for Democracy, is the U.S. agenda. Chavez is promoting this alternative participatory democracy. U.S. wants to do drug war and anti-terrorism. Uribe, the president of Colombia, was in Washington yesterday. According to the America's Watch, 56 trade unionists were killed in Colombia last year, up from 40 the year before. How many trade unionists have been killed in Venezuela? I can say none by the government. There might be 1 or 2 peasant organizers, or a few peasant organizers have been killed by the right in Venezuela. That's the difference in the human rights situation in Colombia and Venezuela. I guess which one of them is getting billions of dollars of U.S. tax dollars. And then finally, of course, there's this division over Cuba. Right? And there's fundamental difference about that. Okay, so I'm just going to finish with a little bit again of the contrast. This is a poster. I took this picture in Caracas. The one's in the middle class area, and you can see sort of just why the C vote was to get Chavez out of power. And so you can sort of get the idea of sort of the different kinds of campaigns that were waged. And the last 2 slides I like a lot. I took these pictures at a big demonstration that the Venezuelans were holding to demonstrate their commitment to keeping national control of the oil company. This woman says, Senor Bush, who's given you the right to, who has said that you are the Lord of the world, that you can take our resources from us, that Jesus Christ has given to every country, respect us. I went up to her, and she had her little, and she was just sitting there, and she looked tired from marching, and she didn't have this unrolled. I just thought it was an interesting picture. I said, can I take your picture? She said yes, and she very proudly unrolled this out so I could take it. And then the last one is requires no translation, but it tells you exactly where the Venezuelans are coming from when it comes to oil policy. So sorry I ran a little bit over. Thank you, and hope we can talk.